Hi friends, today we're going over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you have no idea what those things mean, or if you have a little bit of an idea and you're looking to improve your coding skills, this is the right video for you. So let's get started. To open up an HTML file, it's really easy. All you have to do is go on your desktop, right click, go to new, text document, and we're going to call ours practice. When you go into your notepad, you can actually type HTML directly into it. And when you save it, it'll be a web browser. And I think that's pretty cool. So HTML is made up of tags. Tags start with a less than and a greater than sign. That's the opening tag. The closing tag is the same thing, except it has a forward slash right after the less than sign. So the first tag that we have to do is HTML. That tells the computer what the document is. Inside the HTML tag, we'll have a body tag. And the body tag is where most of the code in the HTML file will go, unless you have like a head tag or a meta tag or a style or script tag. And we'll go over those in a little bit. Inside our body, we'll have our first tag, and we're going to have ours be a button tag, but you can have an H1, H2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And those are heading tags, which are basically large heading fonts. You can have a P tag, which is a paragraph tag. You can have an image tag where you can make an image, an input tag where you can have the user input some information. You can have a form tag so it can be submitted. There's tons and tons of these, and they're all very useful. We're going to have a button tag, and in between the button tag, we're going to put some text. So I'm going to say, hello, this is my first button. When we go to save this, we'll click Save As. And instead of a text document, we're going to go to All Files. We're going to save this as practice.html. And that's the key. All of your files have to be named .html in order for the computer to know that they're an HTML file. When we save that, we see that we get a little Google Chrome tab over here. And if we open this up, you can see it says, hello, this is my first button, which is what we just typed over here, which is pretty cool. Now, coding in a notepad is kind of tedious because once your code becomes hundreds of lines long, it'll be very difficult to know what you look at. So there's a thing called Visual Studio Code, which is a code editor that most programmers use. You can download it. It's a very easy, straightforward download process. And I'm sure there's a bunch of resources online for you to figure out how to do that if you're having trouble. So we're going to create a new folder here, and we're going to call it JavaScript. And when we right click on that, we can see we can open it with code with the little blue ribbon here. Now we have a folder opened to write all of our code. And in our JavaScript folder that we just created, we're going to have a new file called index.html. Index is the main name for any HTML file that you use so that most programmers can actually find it, the main source of your HTML. So we're just going to copy over all this code that we wrote in our notepad and paste it in here. And one of the extensions on VS Code that is very useful is an extension called Live Server. And you can type that into the extensions tab here and install it. I've already got mine installed. And what Live Server allows us to do is when we right click on our file, we can open it with Live Server, and that will give us a practice file on the internet to actually look at so that we don't have to go through deployment and a whole bunch of other very tedious, time-consuming tasks. So when we go to this, the first thing we're going to want to do is right click on it and go to inspect. And when you click on that, you'll see elements. And if we highlight our body, that this is where our HTML is. If we highlight our body, the body gets highlighted. And if we highlight the button, you can see that we're highlighting this button up here. So if we click on that, we can go over to the right and we can see there's a sign that says button and then these curly brackets and then a whole bunch of stuff in between here. And what this is a CSS element. So if we copy all of this and brought it over to here, we could put it in a style tag. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and that's what these are. So we'll have to end our style tag. And in between this style tag, we can actually output CSS. So we'll do what's being done over here. And this is just the CSS that already comes with the button that we create. But if we want to make our own, we can do it right here. So we'll type button, and don't forget the curly brackets. And I'm going to want to put an element in here that says color. And we're going to change that to blue. When we save this, we can see that, first of all, our file is already updated, which is what Live Server does. And we can see that the text inside this button is blue. If we changed it to green, saved it, it would change to green. In order to change the element itself, the button element, we'll have to say background color, and we can make that as green. We'll make it as blue. I like blue better. And then we can change the color, which will be the text color, to white. So already we're doing HTML and CSS, and it hasn't even been 10 minutes. So congratulations. If we want to add more styles to this, we can do that. And there's many other things that you can do with CSS, like we'll give it a position of absolute. I'm not going to go in too much to CSS right now because this is mainly an intro video and we're going to have to get into some JavaScript. But position absolute basically allows you to move this anywhere you want. If we type top and we type 500 pixels, let's type 50 pixels because then it will disappear. We save that, we can see it goes down because what's happening here is the element is going 50 pixels from the top of the page. We'll put left and we'll do 300 pixels. And that moves it a little to the center. Let's do 350. And the CSS, if you notice, you have to have everything in a row. It should be indented from the tag. You have to have a colon after the attribute that you're laying. And then the value to that has to have a semicolon after it. These are very important. If I put that off and I saved it, everything would not work. Let's redo that. Another thing with CSS is if you have an attribute on the tag, which is where you go from the opening tag after the word is typed, so right before the greater than sign, you can have attributes on HTML. And attributes can be ID, they can be class, they can be a whole bunch of different things. But for this, we're going to do ID, and we're going to set that equal. And we have to put the in quotes here because that's what's called a string, which is a data type. There are strings, which are basically words or anything that you can put in characters. There's numbers, which will be something that you can't do as an HTML tag, but there's numbers, booleans, which are true or false, and there's some other different data types. We'll get into that during the JavaScript section. So we're going to give this an ID of btn1. Now, if I go over here and I have a style that says btn1, I can put it over here and I can copy all of this stuff and it'll be the same. But you can see that this isn't highlighted. And the reason for that is because we have to put a selector there. And the selector for IDs in CSS is a hashtag. So that makes it happen. If we got rid of this button tag or the button style element, we saved it, nothing would change. Now we can get rid of this here and it'll go back to normal. So let's resave that. And the reason we do this is because we might want to have multiple buttons. If we do that and we take away the ID element, it'll just be another regular button like this. So that's why we have IDs. Classes are a similar thing, but classes usually have multiple multiple elements in them. So we can use this as a class and we'll call it btn1, and then we can do this class too. And the reason nothing updated is because instead of the hashtag for the selector for btn1, which would be an ID, we have to put a dot, and that's the class selector. So if we save this, you actually can't see it, but there is another button behind here. So that's a little bit of HTML attributes in CSS. Let's move on to JavaScript. So first, let's get rid of these extra buttons because we don't need them. And we're going to change this back to ID. So JavaScript is put out in a script tag. And like I said, usually there will be another JavaScript file that's called index.js or app.js or whatever. But we're going to do it in here. You can do it in your own HTML file, and that's under a script tag. So JavaScript is very interesting. The main reason that we have this console, which is to the right of the elements, is so that we can log things out to the console. I mean, that's not the main reason, but for this video it is. When we do a JavaScript function called console.log, you can log anything out to the console and see it. So let's type a string and it's going to say hello. Save that. And we can see that printed out on the console is a text that says hello. We can also print out numbers. Oops. We can also print out numbers like 2, 3, and it'll print out an actual number. I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually in blue text, which means it's a different data type than a string. So console logging things is a great way to keep track of what you're doing and to check your work. So what JavaScript allows us to do, among many other things, is grab items from our HTML document. And the way that we can do that for this particular one is we'll say document, which is our HTML document. And actually we can console log that out so that you can see it. Console.log document. And as you can see down here, we have a document, and if we highlight it, it highlights our whole HTML document. If we get inside of it, there's the HTML tag, the head tag, the body tag, and inside the body, we can see we have our button here. So this document gives us a lot of leeway into grabbing elements from our document. So let's grab this button tag by saying document.get element by ID, and we'll put a parentheses in here. This is a method, and the dot is calling action to that method. And we have a string here, and we can put btn1. And if we take this and we console log it, so let's copy that, paste it down here, get rid of this, save that, and we have our button that's logged to the console. So the way that what do we want to do with this? Well, I want to grab this element and make it that when I click on it, something happens. So how do we do that? And actually the first thing we need to do here is change this from a class selector to an ID selector, save that, and now we've got our button back. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to want to write a function that happens whenever we click on this button. So the way that we do that is, first of all, let's take this document.getElementById and save it in something that we can reuse easily, because it's pretty hard to type this out every time, and you might actually run into bugs when you're doing that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a variable. Variables start with either the word const, the word let, or the word var. And I'm not going to go too deep into what these three things mean, but const basically means that it's constant. It won't change unless you manually change it yourself. Let means that it is changeable. And var means that it's pretty movable throughout all of the uh, the document. And it's kind of a weird thing that's debatable whether or not it's useful, because it's a new thing with the ES6 in JavaScript. But we're going to go with const, and we're going to say const btn1, which is the name of our ID up here. We're going to set that equal to this. Let me get rid of that, put it over here, and then we're just going to console.log btn1. And as you can see, the same exact thing is being outputted to the console. So now we can use this btn1 constant variable anywhere in our code, which is extremely useful. So when we click on this button, we're going to do what's called an event listener. And the way that we do that is we say btn1, which is our button, dot add event listener. And you can add a lot of different events on here. You can add a keyboard event. So if somebody types in the keyboard, a submit event, if you have a form and you submit it. But we're going to have what's called a click event. And all we do is we put in quotations here and we say click. And then after that, we put a comma, a space, and it's going to allow us to create a function. Now, what is a function? A function is something that runs when you call it. And when you run it, whenever you determine that that's what you want to run, the code executes in between the brackets of that function. So function looks like this. It's a parentheses and then an equal sign and then a greater than sign and then the brackets. So that's one way to write a function. There are many different ways. For example, we could actually save a function into a variable. So we call it const my function, and we'll set that equal to the word function with parentheses immediately after, and then we can call it like this. That's another way to run a function. And what we can do is we can console.log this is my function. So all we have to do is, let's comment this out real quick. We don't have to console log it. We can just run it. So we can say my function, and the way that you call a function is by putting the parentheses afterwards. But when we do that and we refresh here, it doesn't say it. So let's ignore that for now. But just so you know that this is a way to call a function. Our function is going to be something different. It's called an arrow function. And the way that you can do this, you can save it into a variable as well, but we can just get rid of the word function here. We can have the parentheses and the equal sign and the greater than sign. So that's a much easier way, and it allows you to do asynchronous code, which is something that we'll get into further on down the line. But long story short, when we have our button 1 and we add an event listener, it listens for the click to happen here, and then it calls a function. So what do we want to do in this function? Well, I want to have a second button that says something else appear when we click this button. So how do we do that? Well, we can have something called a create element. So we'll have a button called button 2, and we'll say document dot create element. And notice the capitalizations here, they're really important. And what we do in here is we pass it an HTML tag in the quotes. So we can have a P for a paragraph, we can have an H1 for a heading, and we're just going to do a button. So let's actually just console this out to the DOM and see what we get. Comment this out here. And we see we get a new button. How cool is that? So the question is, how do we make this button do what we want? Well, we can write a function in this click event that makes our first button disappear and makes the second button reappear. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So the first thing we're going to want to do is give this second button the same ID that this button has, so that we can have the same sort of CSS style effects, so that we don't have another button that's off in the corner somewhere. The way that we do that is we say btn2, which is our new button, dot ID, and we're going to set that equal to btn1. And we'll close this off with a semicolon. You don't actually have to do this anymore, but it's a common practice. So whenever you finish a line and it's done being defined, you can put a colon at the end of that, and that will end it. And we also want to put a different HTML inside of this button. And the way that we do that is we say btn2 dot inner, and then in capitals HTML. We'll set that equal to, hello, this is my second button. Close that off with a semicolon, and we'll save that. Now when it prints out, you can see that we have the button down here with an ID of button 1, and it says, hello, this is my second button. Now that's not shown up on our page yet, but the way that we do that is with this click event listener. So when we click, we're going to want to remove the first button. And the way that we do that is with document.body, because we're going inside of our body of our HTML and we're taking this button out. And we're going to say dot remove child. In the parentheses here, this is a method that's called, and it removes the child element that we're looking at. And we're going to say btn1. So it's going to remove that when we click on it. And just to see that in action, we click on this here, our button is gone. So that's pretty cool, but we can't get it back. So what we're going to want to do is replace that with another button, and that's going to be our second button. So we're going to say document.body.append child. And that's just going to do the opposite of remove, which is just add it to our screen. And we're going to click button 2. We'll save that. Now when we click on this button, it says, hello, this is my second button. So that's pretty cool. What I actually want to do is I want to change the color and some of the CSS attributes of this. So I want to change the background color to red, and I want to change the text color to black when we do this. So how do we do that? Well, we can't change the CSS because that's fixed in another style script, or style tag rather. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set something that changes every time we click. And it's easy to do that with a number. So we're going to say const count equals 0. And this is the instance where we're not going to actually want to use const. We're going to want to use let. And let allows us to change this anywhere in our field whenever we want to. So now that the count is equal to 0, we're going to want to change it to 1. Count equals, and by the way, this is an equal sign, but it's actually an assignment operator. So we're assigning count, the variable count, to 0. And there's another thing called an equality operator to see what it is actually equal to. And I'll show you that in a little bit. So we're going to say count is equal to count plus 1. So we're going to add it from 0 to 1. And in this, we're going to want to do something called an if statement. And an if statement basically checks if something is true or false and then does something. So an if statement is just like this: if, and then we're going to have parentheses. And so we'll say if count triple equals 0, and the triple equals is the equality operator. So now we're checking if the count is actually equal to 0. We're not setting it to 0. We're saying, is it equal? Whereas over here with the equal sign, we're saying we're setting the count to 0. So we're saying if count is equal to 0, and then everything after the if statement comes in between these two curly brackets. So we're going to copy all of this and put it down here. Type that in. And what we're going to want to do after this is actually console.log the count. So we'll see that. And you might as well console log the count when we've rendered the DOM too, just so that we can see it as 0. So when we save that, what's console logged here is 0. When we click on this button, the button changes, and now our count is updated to 1. So how do we click back to make this the first button after we click on it? Well, the way that we do that is we're going to have the same kind of event listener for the second button. So all we can do is copy this code right here and paste it down here. Whoops, that always happens. We'll paste it down there, and instead of saying button1.add event listener, we'll change it to button2. So now when this clicks, we're going to see if something happens. Then we're going to do pretty much the same thing, except for the child that we're going to remove is button2, since that's the one being displayed right now, and we're going to append button1. We're going to see that if that is the count is equal to 1. But once we have a count equal to 1, it's not equal to 0 anymore, and we're going to want to set it back to that so that when we click on it, it can go back to our first button. So we're actually going to set this to count equals count minus 1. And then we're going to be console logging the count. So if we save that, should see now that when we click on it, it goes to our second button. And then when we click on this, it goes back to our first button. First, second, and we can see that the count is being logged as 1 and 2. So now all we have to do is we have to add another style right here that says button2 for an ID. And we're going to change this to red, which is our background color. And we're going to change the text color to black. So now when we move down here, instead of having our button2 ID be button1, we're going to have our button2 ID be button2. So now the CSS in this style tag will update. So let's see how that works. Click save. Hello, this is my first button. Hello, this is my second button. And now you can see that it's red and has black text. Go back, go back, go back, go back. And it works. So this was an intro to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. I hope you learned a lot. There's a lot more coming. And yeah, hope you have a great day.